In the middle of the night on January 31, 1968, 10,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers broke into the historic city of Hue, a major cultural center of South Vietnam. A few days later, these troops captured the city, which surprised the American commanders, who were slow to understand what had happened and what enemy they now faced. The Vietnamese army spotted the strange-looking armored vehicles while firing at the buildings they held. They did not look like traditional tanks at all and moved much faster. They had no turret or one big cannon and were only about 7 feet high and 8 feet wide. These were M50 Ontos tank destroyers. Despite its unconventional appearance, it was an important part of the Corps' armored forces during the Vietnam War. The Ontos program began in November 1950 as a joint Army/Marines program. The development contract was awarded to Ellis-Chalmers Agricultural Equipment Division and work was carried out at the company's agricultural assembly plant in LaPorte, Indiana. In 1953, the prototype was presented to the U.S. Army, and they immediately hated what they saw. They did not like that it was so small and too tall, and that there was not enough room inside for either a crew of 3 or for ammunition for recoilless rifles, of which only 18 rounds could be carried. They didn't like that the tower was so shallow that it was actually nothing more than a cast steel turntable with a trapdoor in the middle. They were not satisfied with the fact that the 6 recoilless rifles that were part of his armament were installed outside and had to be reloaded from the outside, that the half-inch armor on the sides did not protect the crew members from a machine gun of more than 50 caliber rounds, and that the armor plate of the lower part was not even half of such thickness, which made it completely vulnerable to mines or anything that could explode under it. The Army abandoned the project, canceling its share of the order for 1,000 vehicles. The Marines, on the other hand, were not as fussy. They liked that the Ontos was so fast and agile and seemed to be able to go anywhere, which most tanks couldn't. They agreed that instead of fighting enemy tanks, the Ontos would have to shoot and run to a place where it could safely reload. As for the apparent lack of protection, they shrugged. For Marines, being shot at was nothing new. They placed an order for 297 Ontos. The production contract was awarded to Ellis-Chalmers, which began production in 1955 and completed in 1957, and the first vehicle was accepted by the Marine Corps on October 31, 1956. The official name of Ontos was Rifle 106 mm self-propelled artillery M50. It was based on the 106 mm M40 recoilless rifle, a weapon that was developed after World War II as a tank destroyer based on the earlier 105 mm M27 recoilless rifle, which turned out to have a number of key flaws. While testing the Ontos at the Army's Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, all 6 guns were fired at the same time, and the backlash was so violent that it knocked bricks out of nearby buildings and shattered the windows of numerous vehicles. The accuracy of the powerful recoilless rifles has been greatly improved by the installation of 50 caliber spotting rifles on 4 of the 6 M40 Ontos. The rifle fired a tracer, the trajectory of which, at least for the first 1,100 yards, was almost identical to that of the M40, and the point of impact was marked by a visible puff of smoke. The corrective rifle's native range was only 1,500 yards, and hitting targets beyond that required target shooting and fire adjustment techniques. The Ontos was first deployed during the 1958 Lebanon crisis. Since it was a peaceful intervention, no action was taken. 6 years later, he nevertheless entered combat during the American intervention in the Dominican Republic in 1964. There he met and quickly destroyed several enemy tanks, including a French AMX-13 and an old Swedish L-60. This was the only time the Ontos completed the mission for which it was designed. Then there was Vietnam. In 1965, during the initial buildup of U.S. infantry forces, the Marines deployed 2 anti-tank battalions equipped with Ontos. Since there were no enemy tanks, the companies of Ontos were quickly dispersed and attached to other units. The problem was that, since there was no doctrine for them other than anti-tank combat, the Ontos were used or not used mostly at the whim of the commander of the unit to which they were attached. Although they quickly established themselves as highly effective infantry support weapons, providing excellent frontal fire and flanking protection, the Ontos had some serious shortcomings. After one or two of them were destroyed by mines or rocket-propelled grenades, the unit commander often found that his enthusiasm for them waned significantly and transferred them to static defensive functions. Another problem that plagued the Ontos was the repeated accidental firing of recoilless rifles due to fire lines being too tight. Despite this, the Ontos continued to be used to support the infantry. Using heat-treated shells, the Ontos was an excellent bunker destroyer, but where he really excelled was in anti-personnel weapons. For the M40, a hive projectile was developed that, when detonated, released a massive vortex cloud of nearly 10,000 steel arrows. In December 1967, the Marines reorganized their anti-tank battalions, with the result that all Ontos units were assigned to tank battalions. By this point, the Ontos had begun to wear out. Steps and other spare parts became increasingly difficult to obtain. Ontos was increasingly cannibalized to force others to work. It was already clear that his days were numbered. Then, on January 30, 1968, the NVA launched the Tet Offensive. It was one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the entire Vietnam War, and nowhere was it as hard as in the city of Hue. For Ontos, this battle was a shining moment of glory. After American and South Vietnamese forces cleared the south bank of the Spirit River, the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines reached the citadel. Several Ontos pulled themselves up. One after another began to destroy the buildings in which the enemy sat down. One of the Marine officers who led the siege of the citadel later called the Ontos the most effective of all the means of supporting the Marine Corps at the Battle of Hue. Given the expected threat from NVA armored vehicles, 10 Onto were transferred to Khe Sanh by MH-53 helicopter and included in its defense. There, Ontos also showed himself with distinction. A year later, the Marines disabled their Ontos units, and the vehicles were assigned to the Army's Light Infantry Brigade. The Army used them until they ran out of parts, and then used them as bunkers. What happened to them after that is largely unknown. After Vietnam, some were taken over by civilian agencies and used as logging vehicles. A small number of copies fell into the hands of collectors. Some are in museums. According to Mike Scudder, a former Marine with multiple tanks, there are more World War I tanks in circulation than Ontos. In fact, this may not be true, as more than 60 Ontos are believed to lie abandoned in the desert on a Marine Corps reservation near China Lake, California. If they are still there, no one speaks.